Welcome to the 41st episode of A Change is a Chance. My name is Ryan Lowe, and it is my goal to educate listeners, especially the youth, on the most polarizing issues in this world by interviewing different experts who can lead us into the charge for change. Today in the United States, we live in an administration where the president calls climate change a hoax. Not only that, but we as a country are nowhere close to fulfilling our promises and pledges to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, Donald Trump actually cut these promises off by leaving the Paris Climate Accords. Very few countries are actually making significant progress on their progressive climate policy, and yet our world needs it now more than ever before. So, what does it take for us Americans and us as a world to fix this? One way is for each and every one of us to get involved with climate policy and carbon sequestration. So today, I am talking with the founder of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, Dr. Wil Burns. The Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal is a research center within American University's School of International Service in Washington, D.C. It is dedicated to assessing the social, legal, ethical, and political implications of carbon removal technology. The Institute actively collaborates with diverse stakeholders to champion responsible, democratic, just, and equitable carbon removal practices. As for Dr. Burns himself, his primary research focuses on carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, strategies to combat climate change, as well as the loss and damage provisions of the Paris Agreement. Dr. Burns has extensively explored various CDR technologies, including ocean-based approaches like ocean alkalinity enhancement, and has emphasized the importance of implementing these technologies responsibly to ensure that they contribute effectively to climate mitigation efforts. So how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thank you for inviting me, Ryan.
Of course. I'm very excited to chat with you today about this. So my first question for you, Dr. Burns, is what do carbon removal policies actually look like currently in the United States, and how far are we from those goals that I talked about earlier?
Yeah. Well, let me give you a little bit of context, right, in terms of what we need and where we are. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, which is the leading international scientific research body on climate issues, has said that given the legacy emissions, the emissions that we've put in the air, many of which carbon dioxide, for example, can stay in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, as well as our ongoing burgeoning greenhouse gas emissions, mean that we've now reached a point in history where if we're going to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, not only do we have to far more aggressively decarbonize the world's economy than we have to date, but we're also going to need large amounts of carbon removal, meaning that we're going to have to remove carbon removal that is in the atmosphere that we've already emitted historically, right? And we're going to have to do this to a very large degree. It's been estimated that by the middle of the century, we may need to be removing somewhere between 8 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and maybe as much as 20 billion tons by the end of the century. But by contrast, where we are right now is if you look at the 2050 goal of maybe removing 10 billion tons a year, we've removed about 0.13% of that goal to date, right? So we have a tremendous way to go, and it's not as far off as we think, right? It's a quarter of a century, and we're going to need to massively accelerate our commitment. And again, at the same time that we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a daunting task.
Yeah. And so those stats, is that for the United States or for the whole world?
That's for the whole world. I mean, the United States is not that much far advanced. We, to our credit, during the Biden administration at least, started devoting substantial amounts of investment to carbon removal, right? And so the Biden administration, under the Infrastructure Reduction Act, largely under that act, committed about $3.5 billion to carbon removal. A lot of that focused on one kind of carbon removal approach, which is called direct air capture, which are essentially gigantic filtration systems that take in ambient air, separate out the carbon dioxide, pressurize it into a supercritical form, and then transport it for storage underground or for use, right? And so the Biden administration had committed to building four demonstration plants around the country for direct air capture. And the idea was each one of those would capture at least 1 million tons of CO2, and that they would provide us with learning and and help us to bring down the costs of this approach. All of that is in peril at this point, but it was a commitment on the part of this country. Europe has some investments also, some in Asia also. But again, we need to really accelerate the commitment to this approach if it's going to make any kind of difference.
Yeah, I was about to ask how that might have changed in the current administration. Thanks for answering that. Would you say maybe is there a country that is doing this well?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly countries that are doing it better than we are at this point, right? Because it's uncertain what the future is for carbon removal here. Sweden is pretty good. Sweden is committed to one specific kind of approach called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So you use bioenergy feedstocks like crop residues or forest residues to produce energy, and then when you burn or combust that bioenergy, you capture it at the flue stack where you're burning it, and then again ship it for storage. Uh, Sweden is blessed with a lot of forests and hence a lot of bioenergy capabilities, and so they've dedicated themselves to do that. Switzerland it has the largest direct air capture company. Not that most of its facilities are there, but the Swiss are looking at the role of direct air capture, and the European Union more generally, and the United Kingdom are also providing fairly substantial amounts of investment for these approaches. But again, a lot more needs to be done, and a lot of the problem that we have is we're relying on demand for these carbon removal approaches to be from what's called the voluntary carbon markets. So companies just deciding to purchase, carbon removal credits to help meet their net zero commitments. And the problem is there's very few of those countries that are purchasing carbon removal in those markets. Microsoft, for example, purchases about 60% of all those credits. Then it falls down to like 8% when it comes to Google, and 5% for Meta, which is Facebook, and we need a lot more companies with skin in the game. But realistically, we need what's called compliance markets. We have to require that not only do companies reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but they also remove the historic emissions and then their ongoing emissions if we're going to meet these objectives. And that's going to be a hard political sell, but it is what we need.
Well, it's both heartening to see these technologies grow and also kind of scary that we're so far away from it, despite that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. So my next question kind of ties into what you were saying earlier. Many people believe that carbon sequestration technology is a solely scientific issue and solution to climate change, but we both know that nothing can truly change without that political advocacy side. So how do we further push climate, or specifically carbon removal technology, into this whole space of policy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, one of the things is that we don't have a lot of public information about carbon removal, and so when recent surveys have indicated that maybe 2 or 3% of the American people, for example, have ever heard of carbon removal, and and even those that think they have heard of carbon removal often conflate it with things like solar energy or carbon capture and storage, right? Which is a different technology. It's a technology where you're capturing CO2 at the source where you're combusting, right? Whereas carbon removal is capturing the CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So there's very little understanding of carbon removal, and as a consequence, it's not terribly surprising. There's very little uh, uh, commitment on the part of the public to carbon removal, right? So we need to educate the public about carbon removal. We also need to educate the public about this because there's no free lunch with these approaches. They're going to cost money. Some of them pose risks, and in a democratic society, it's important that the public have a role or input into that process, right? But it's very difficult to figure out given all of the information that people take in, and quite frankly, increasingly in a lot of our society, I think we're seeing contempt for science. It's hard to convince people that they should engage with what is an intrinsically scientific sort of approach, right? And so our institute and others have at least been trying to engage the public. We hold workshops, for example, where we bring together people that might directly have contact with these kind of technologies because companies are proposing, for example, to put one of these facilities in their community. We bring those communities together to try to deliberate about what they think about these approaches and how to negotiate with the companies to ensure that their interests are protected and that they get benefits from these projects. But that we're going to need to expand that on a large scale, and it's going to have to be people other than just one university doing that.
Yeah. Well, what you were just talking about there sounds like an environmental justice issue. So it's really great that you tackle that too.
It is an environmental justice. I mean, there's a issue because there's a couple of things. I mean, in any of these cases where you're citing facilities, for example, like a direct air capture facility, it's going to require large amounts of energy, including renewable energy, right? So then the question is this the best use of renewable energy if there's a limited amount of it, right? And if we take that renewable energy and it requires us to then burn more fossil fuels, right? Our communities of color and other vulnerable communities going to be disproportionately impacted by that, for example, right? Or uh, if we say that we have carbon removal to help us address climate change, are we going to reduce our commitment to reducing fossil fuel emissions, right? And if we do that, we know that fossil fuel emissions create all kinds of harms in vulnerable communities beyond just carbon dioxide, right? Nitrous oxides, mercury, and so forth. And so environmental justice communities need to be engaged in these issues and need to try to help negotiate outcomes that protect notions of equity and justice.
Yes, absolutely. And I do love that you are merging this political side with this scientific side, with this justice and more, I guess, activism-based side. It's really great. Speaking of all three of those things, actually, let's
Yeah.
talk specifically about the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. What is your role there? How did the organization start? And what are some specific projects that you have tackled regarding carbon removal within the org?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ryan. So we started off as with a different name called the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment in 2012 at American University, and we focused on another kind of geoengineering called solar radiation management, which is trying to reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation that's trapped by these greenhouse gases. Right. The other kind of geoengineering is the one we're talking about right now, which is carbon removal, right? So eventually, as carbon removal began to be discussed more, we decided to establish an independent research group to look at those issues. And the primary reason that we set up the Institute was that we were afraid that a lot of the discussion about carbon removal was technocratic. It was by scientists. And certainly scientists need to play a profound role in this because they're the ones that help to develop these technologies and assess these technologies. But there are some, as we've already discussed, some profound social justice issues. There's also issues of how to govern these approaches, what kind of laws should be put in place. And we believed that those issues were not really the province of scientists. And so we created, because we're largely a group of social scientists, the Institute to do it. And I'm the co-director of the Institute, and my background's in international environmental law. So we have several ongoing sort of projects at this point. One is the one that we talked about already, which was public engagement, right? We're trying to bring communities that may be engaging with startup companies, for example, that want to develop carbon removal projects in their communities, bring them together with those startups to talk about how to protect community interests, how to maximize benefits, and so forth, right? And to do it in a way that's not just a 1 hour listening session, but actually means you're listening to the community and trying to, in some cases, co-create these projects with those communities and involve those communities on an ongoing basis in monitoring those projects, right? So that's one thing that we do. Another thing we do is we work on a lot of legal issues associated with governance. So, for example, I'm looking at a proposal called a carbon take-back obligation that, again, would say that instead of trying to get the amount of carbon removal we need, which is momentous, by simply relying on the kindness of corporations and voluntary commitments, that we ultimately view this as a waste management issue and say, just as is true with you or I, who are not allowed to walk out into the community and just strew garbage on the streets, companies should not be allowed to do that too. And so if you're a fossil fuel company and you're creating waste of carbon dioxide, you should be obligated to clean it up by either developing your own carbon removal technologies or to pay others to do that cleanup, right? And we believed that that would massively expand demand for carbon removal, help to bring down costs, and get us to where we need to be, right? So we've just launched that project in conjunction with an organization called Carbon Balance Initiative in Oxford and the Oxford Net Zero group within Oxford University. And then one final thing that I would highlight is we do a lot of work on marine carbon removal approaches, right? You had mentioned one of them at the outset, the idea of putting alkalinity in the ocean to convert carbon dioxide to bicarbonates, which means that more CO2 from the atmosphere could then enter into the oceans, and so it would draw down CO2, right? Or seaweed farming or other approaches of that sort. Those approaches may have promise, but they also pose risks. And because a lot of these would be done in the open ocean, they can affect the global commons, right? And so the global community has both a need and a right to be involved in the governance of those approaches. So we're trying to develop approaches within treaty regimes that currently exist and maybe new treaty regimes to effectively govern those approaches. And those are the primary things that we work on. And we also do a lot of educational outreach, right? The kind of thing we were talking about. We try to provide fact sheets and videos for the public to be able to understand these approaches and to get the public involved in deciding which of these approaches we should deploy at what levels and how we pay for these technologies.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I want to say it's really great that you do work with marginalized communities because a lot of the times these, I mean, and this is not your institute, but things like carbon removal, these technologies do take up a lot of money and that can
Yeah,
negatively affect these communities. It's
yeah,
really great that you actually work with them
yeah,
because,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it is
It's
can
it's
be bad. Yeah.
critical. It's critical. It's. I mean, these a lot of these frontline communities, of course, were the ones that were most negatively impacted by fossil fuel development. And one of the things that we hope to do at the Institute is ensure that solutions to climate change don't negatively impact these very same communities. And so we and others are working together to try to ensure that that doesn't occur.
Yeah, I do. The organization and what they do seems really interesting, and it's great that you have started this. So let's talk more about that process. Your institute, the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, dedicates a lot of its efforts around outreach and education, as you've been talking about, like the podcast, webinars, the research. How does public perception factor, and what can you do with like your media sources to elevate your issues?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, the vast majority of the public haven't engaged at all with carbon removal, right? But some who have sometimes have some serious reservations about carbon removal, right? And sometimes I think it's a question of bringing together scientists and communities to provide more information because sometimes I think there are some misconstruences of how these technologies work. At other times, as I said, these technologies potentially do pose threats. And one of the things that's important to do is to figure out both how to minimize those threats and also to kind of acknowledge that given the fact that climate change can create some serious threats, we have to balance those kind of threats. But we need to talk about that as a society, right? That there's sometimes what we call risk trade-offs, right? And how do we as a society acknowledge that, right? That even the things that we do to respond to climate change are going to pose some risks, and how do we balance those risks, right? But to do that, you have to provide information to the public so that they understand these technologies, understand the issues, and can weigh in on those sort of issues. And that's a long-term sort of enterprise, but it's something that our organization and some allied organizations are committed to.
Yeah, that's really great. And let me just come back to what I was trying to say earlier. Where do this idea of spreading the word, how does that sometimes just create a roadblock for the Institute? Or even if not, just where have you found the greatest challenges?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think one challenge is that a lot of the approaches we're talking about involve some pretty complicated science, right? And so a lot of members of the general public don't have extensive background in science or is certainly engineering, which is what a lot of these approaches are. But these also involve chemistry and biology a lot of times. It's a lot to expect, okay? Even if, as I said, and I do believe, unfortunately, there's an increasing kind of pride in not embracing science, even at those that want to. It's daunting to be able to develop all of this kind of expertise. I mean, I've been working on this issue for 13 years, right? And sometimes we're going into communities and asking them to understand these things right in the course of days, right? So, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to do is to try to scaffold these sort of engagements, right? Develop effective information resources, online information resources, or paper information resources that the community can review in advance of bringing in a group of scientists to talk to them, right? And then the other thing that's a challenge and is really important is if you're going to bring in scientists to communicate with a community, you have to have scientists that are really good communicators, and not all scientists are. As some scientists simply can't explain their science to a lay audience at all. Some of them don't try, quite frankly, and that frustrates me. But some of them just so live in the science, they assume people know things that they don't know what terms mean, and so forth. And they just start discussing these issues, and they quickly lose audiences and frustrate them, right? There are some scientists, however, that are excellent communicators that really understand, well, how do I explain this? How do I create analogies, right, that help the communities understand what these approaches mean? How do I break this down into ways that are easier to digest, right? And that requires a genuine commitment on their part and some training. And one of the unfortunate things is that at the university level, when we train scientists, and we certainly in the United States and in a lot of other countries, right, train some excellent scientists, right? Most of the time, we don't train them to communicate to outside of the academy, right? And that's unfortunate in my mind. I think everybody who goes through a PhD program in the sciences, probably a master's program, should have a course on communicating their ideas, right? It's in their best interest because they're going to be more effective and more fulfilled if others understand what they're doing and try to embrace it. And it's going to mean that in a lot of cases, for example, at public universities where we provide support to these kind of programs, that the public is going to be able to get the fruits of that science by getting scientists that can effectively communicate that science to them in ways that can help them in a democracy make decisions.
Yeah, that does sound like both a major factor in this and also an issue if you don't have scientists who can communicate. So then how does the Institute deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're social scientists. One of the things we have to be careful about too is that the social science we communicate is done in a way that the public can understand. The law is often intimidating to people, right? So if I'm talking to a community about legal issues, right, I can't assume that they've spent a lot of time on the law, right? And I have to explain to them how the law works, what their role is, what the procedures are, right? What's the substantive parts of the law, and so that's a responsibility on my part, as is true with others. If I'm our research director who works mostly on public engagement, again, I have to figure out how to explain how a community benefit agreement works, right? How a community enters into a contract with a company to ensure that the project that they may accept in the community provides certain kinds of benefits, right? And how to design those kind of contracts, right? So we spend a lot of time at the Institute thinking about how to effectively communicate and then trying to review our experiences with the public and determine if we failed or succeeded in doing so, right? It's a constant learning process on our part, but it's one that we're committed to, because if you're not doing that, then why are you doing this work?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you try to stay down to earth with all of that by improving, because as I've been talking about before, sometimes these bigger scientific solutions and such do not interact with communities
Yeah.
that. And I'm glad that you do. That has been a major point for me of why this organization is so great. So let's talk about, I guess, a broader sense of carbon removal and then which includes your institute, the current administration. So right now,
Yeah.
our current administration and its leader do not support climate change work or activism. As you know, Trump has called climate change a hoax many times and proudly says things like drill, baby, drill at the RNC. So,
Yeah.
what impacts can and will this administration have for the next 4 years on climate policy and then specifically climate removal? And what do you foresee as future hurdles for your organization in terms of this?
Yeah. Well, it's something we think a lot about. I mean, in a very real sense, for example, we have um, uh, uh, grants from the government. We have a National Science Foundation grant, for example, that's in peril right now, quite frankly, because our grant is to help Native American tribes to communicate with and negotiate with carbon removal companies that may want to develop projects with those tribes or in areas where there's tribal interest. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, where fisheries could be impacted by some of these approaches, right? And so we in 2023 and 2024 proposed a grant that would develop a toolkit that would help tribal communities understand the legal issues, how to develop community benefit agreements with companies, how to understand the science, and so forth. And there's been ongoing discussion now with the National Science Foundation if this falls under the rubric of, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and potentially we no longer will have access to those grant funds, right? So we have that on a day-to-day basis. More broadly, when it comes to carbon removal, it's hard to know what this administration will do. It's funny, if you look at climate policy in general, I can't sugarcoat it. It's wielding a massive chainsaw to climate science. It's removing the ability to measure climate changes. It's trying to make the argument that that climate change has no negative impacts and that CO2 may actually be a good thing for society. It's going to have a profound impact in terms of climate policymaking in the United States. On carbon removal, weirdly enough, there are interests within the Trump administration, whether they have direct financial interests in these technologies or they believe that it's a way to ensure that fossil fuel interests, for example, can ameliorate some of these impacts, and maybe that helps them in terms of the bottom line, are not totally hostile to carbon removal. And so we're not certain yet if a lot of the funding from the Biden administration, for example, is going to be axed in this administration or not, right? The jury is out. But certainly when it comes to the underlying premises of climate change and the need to address climate change in a substantive way, which the Biden administration, quite frankly, did in a more fulsome way, in a more robust way than any administration before. How much of that will survive is definitely in question.
Yeah, seems pretty dangerous right now for a lot of different issues that are similar to this.
Yeah, it really is.
So I only have one more question for you,
Yeah.
and that was more tailored to connecting your institute and the work you're doing with youth like me. So how can youth get involved with the institute and climate act or climate policy in general?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that youth can definitely do, people like yourself and others, are educate other young people about how important this issue is for their future, right? We're already obviously feeling a lot of the negative manifestations of climate change, right? We're seeing violent weather events increase, loss of species, increases in disease in a lot of places we haven't seen it before. Wildfires, obviously, in places like where you live in California. But those are the tip of the spear. Those are the very early manifestations of climate change, right? Temperatures have risen by about 1.1 degrees Celsius above where they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Later in this century, when temperatures have increased by 2 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius, some of the really serious negative impacts of climate change can occur, right? And so those are really pertinent for your generation, right? And so one thing that I think needs to be done is to educate the youth and tell them that this has to be an important issue to them. That's one of the problems with politicians. there's a lot of surveys out there that say, oh, most people think that climate change is real and it's a serious issue, but they don't really mean it. If you ask people in a poll, um, uh, and they do this every year, an organization called Gallup asks people every year, what are your 30 most serious issues, right? And it turns out that when it comes to climate change, for Democrats, it's 28, for Republicans, it's 30, and for independents, it's 29. And
Oh,
why does that make a difference? Well, if you're a politician, the rule of thumb is that if an issue isn't among the first top three or four for somebody as a voter, they're not going to vote for you or against you on that issue. So you don't need to care about it, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you're Exxon, it's issue number one, right? And so you're going to make it clear to politicians, we're not going to provide funding to you, or we're going to try to, develop faux groups to work against you. And so you're going to really toe the line when it comes to those companies often, right? So one of the things that young people need to do is tell politicians, I will vote for you if you are supporting substantive climate policy, or I will vote against you if you're part of the problem, right? And then we start to get the kind of policies that we need, right? So I think that's a really important sort of issue. Um, I think it's important for young people to learn more when it comes to carbon removal, learn more about these technologies, learn, how to get involved in the political process and how, as we decide what role this is going to have, but also think about this as a potential career. There's some estimates that this could be $1 trillion industry in 2040 or 2050, right? So there could be a large number of jobs, and we're going to need really smart young people in the fields of science, engineering, marketing, law, justice, right? All of these sort of things that we've talked about to be part of that ecosystem, right? And we need responsible people that are committed to not only addressing climate change, but also ensuring, again, that we do this, we make this transition just, right? And so I think there's a lot of roles for young people to play in all of this.
yeah, sounds like it. So to summarize, we have education and then we have working in the space itself.
Yeah,
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 that's really
yeah,
great.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, those are all my questions for you today, Dr. Burns. So thank you so much for talking with me. It has been really interesting hearing about this institute.
You're very welcome, Ryan. Thanks again for inviting me.
Of course. I can't tell you how impressed I've been with the Institute of Responsible Carbon Removal, so really thank you so much. That's it for the 41st episode of A Change of the Chance. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next episode.